Hello, and for those of you celebrating, Christ is risen. I'm Ashley Purpura, and I'm the Associate Professor of Religion at Purdue University and the co-editor of the Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought book series with Fordham University Press. I would like to welcome you to this installment of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, which is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. This Fordham Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow the center on YouTube, click like on our programming, and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. I'm joined today by our guest scholar, Dr. Sarah Riccardi-Swartz. Sarah is a postdoctoral fellow in the Luce-funded Recovering Truth, Religion, Journalism, and Democracy, and a post-truth era project in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. An anthropologist, scholar of American religion, and trained documentary filmmaker, she specializes in social politics, media, race, and Orthodox Christianity. And starting this fall, she will be an assistant professor of religion and anthropology at Northeastern and an affiliate faculty in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Welcome, Sarah, and to everyone joining us. So our format today is similar to other episodes. I'll start us off with some discussion questions for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please, for those of you joining us, please do feel free to put any questions for our guests by clicking the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we have disabled the chat, so all comments and questions should go there. All right, Sarah, I'd like to start off by asking you a little bit to tell us a little bit about yourself. How you came to write this book, what is it about, and what do you hope it accomplishes? And if anyone hasn't read it yet, this is the book we're featuring today, Between Heaven and Russia, Religious Conversion and Political Apostasy in Appalachia, and it's phenomenal. And I'm completely biased when I say that. But anyway, Sarah, please start us off.
Oh, wow. Well, those are a lot of questions. I will try to manage them quickly and efficiently. First of all, thank you so much, Ashley, for having me on this wonderful series with all the fabulous speakers that you've already featured. It's quite an honor, so I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate the chance to talk about my book and my research with everyone who's here today and who will eventually see this on our YouTube channel. In terms of about myself, I want to start out with what I like to think about as a scholar. I'm always interested in social transformation in relationship to religion and politics. And that's what actually led me to spend time in Appalachia with this community and to ultimately write Between Heaven and Russia. So the book that you've just seen Ashley hold up is an ethnography, which means it's a study of one community or group of people. In this case, it's based on a year of field work with a growing community of converts to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in Appalachia. I first started visiting this community in 2015. I returned in 2016. I then filmed a documentary there in early 2017, and finally returned for a year of field work in late 2017 to late 2018. And I wanted to sort of think about those issues of transformation, how Russian Orthodoxy was being transformed in the United States by converts, and how, in part because this community had a digital icon studio, the historical category of religious art was being transformed by technology. And to step back, the documentary that I made was actually about the digitization of religious art in that community. So I already had sort of a vested interest in that portion of my research. But when I got there, for those of you who already read the book, you know this, in August of 2017, no one was particularly keen to talk about iconography. They were really interested in sharing their experiences about converting to Orthodoxy, what it meant for them in terms of spirituality, in terms of politics. And Orthodoxy was really transformative for them. For many in this community, conversion to Russian Orthodoxy via ROCOR opened a door to religious and political possibilities that they did not see available to them outside of this in the United States. So I began asking them questions about their political beliefs. So to the list of standardized questions that I would give people during their interviews, many of whom asked for them in advance, I included a section about politics. I would ask, are you political? Do you have a party affiliation? How do you feel about Trump? Because he had just been inaugurated, about 6-7 months prior to that. How do you feel about Vladimir Putin? Now that you're a member of the Russian Orthodox Church and you are a satellite now, and since I was doing my research after 2007, you're a satellite now in many ways of the Moscow Patriarchate. So how do you feel about Putin's relationship with the church? And of course, they could choose not to answer these questions, but nobody declined, and they answered them readily. And from there, the stories unfolded. They saw Putin's new Russia as a beacon of spirituality for the secular West. And their interviews became the basis of the book, which ultimately is a depiction of a community interested in building a holy world through their dedication to Russian Orthodox spirituality and to post-Soviet conservative politics. And so in doing so, I show that they not only, they use not theology, but they use the secular culture wars discourse to sort of shape their vision of an Orthodox world. And in the book, I show how this community of converts, along with other far-right communities of converts and their friends online, lots of social media users, are part of this new type of orthodoxy that I term reactive orthodoxy, which I see as creating a world building project that's built on an imagined nostalgia for pre-revolutionary Russian Orthodoxy, an emphasis on monarchic politics and American Christian nationalism, which seems in tension, but it's there, traditionalism, and ultimately a sort of disenchantment with democracy. Now, you asked me at the end of that very long question, what I hope that this book will accomplish. And, since right now we're part of this Orthodox Center, I hope that in the subfield of Orthodox studies, that this book will draw our attention to the transformation of Orthodox Christian history, both through conversion and through the connective power of media. In other words, I want us to pay attention to what's happening outside of orthodoxy in historic geographical locales. And despite the small numbers, it is a minority faith in the United States of Orthodox Christians here, there's a vocal, even outsized movement of right-wing actors, and they're very participatory in the social drama of orthodoxy across the world. And I think that is important as we think about the trajectory of global Eastern Orthodoxy and the challenges it faces for the future. So that's what I hope the book can contribute to.
Well, that's a lot to think about, right? So we think about you mentioned world building, which of course in your research has kind of a particular type of meaning, but we think about orthodoxy in general, kind of theologically has this type of, we're going to transform the world, and this idea of uniting heaven and earth and liturgy, and here we have it, and very politically, right? There's a political bent, especially in the community that you feature in the book, of we're going to kind of bring that heaven on earth in a way that we're going to see political change, or we're going to see a particular type of gender performance or things like that. So it's really fascinating kind of work that you've been doing over the past few years, and that's featured in this book. So I want you to tell us a little bit about what was most surprising. We've heard that you went in thinking you might study iconography, the digitization of icons in this community, and then came out studying politics and conversion to ROCOR. So maybe what was the most surprising, and then also maybe the most challenging aspect with researching and writing this book?
I think the most surprising thing was actually the admiration for Putin. I really didn't anticipate that. And it was shocking for me. I was in a county that went red for Trump, and we hear these longstanding narratives of Appalachian conservatism and sort of this is red nation, this is MAGA nation. And they didn't really care about that. Of course, the monastery inhabitants didn't vote, right? Monks are not voters. And those who did vote for Trump weren't really, they did so because he wasn't Hillary. That was their their, emphasis on why they would vote for him. But they weren't keen on his vision for the world, and they really were looking elsewhere for their political salvation. In terms of challenges, I would say that fieldwork as a method, since it's the process of listening and documenting and representing, right? It has so many specific challenges to each process. It's also hard as a researcher to realize that your work is some of the first to document a group and its complexities. There are only a handful, as you probably know, Ashley, of anthropologists and social scientists working on orthodoxy in the US. So being one of the first generators of this type of research comes with a lot of responsibilities, both to future academics who might work on or with these communities, but also to the communities themselves. And those responsibilities really come into sharp relief when you work with a small group that has very radical political social worldviews. It's important to let their voices be the drivers of the research and the representation. And that's why, if you have read my book, you'll know that there's these very large sections. Specifically, I am thinking of one that's like almost a page long from the abbot, where it's just his voice. You're reading a complete transcript, right, without any redaction of his words that were recorded. Because I think that's really important that we get the full totality of what people are saying and how they feel about these issues, because they're so divisive right now. Now, in spite of that, right, people become angry at how they're depicted, even if you really try to think about ways to navigate and mitigate, representation issues in the outcome. And the community I worked with was a little bit upset about their depiction. But I would say that the outcry in general has come from the next generation of reactive Orthodox Christians, or WAVE, or whatever you want to call them, that are on social media, right? They're the most radicalized, and they're the most outspoken in their hate for the book. And I should take a step back, because they started posting, as you know, Ashley, they started posting before the book came out. And in part because they received misinformation online. Somebody would say something and it would spread because of the rapid, instantaneous connection of social media. So there were threats, there were attempts to dox me. I will say it's nothing as bad as many of my friends who are extremist researchers have experienced. I feel quite lucky. But what I found fascinating about these posts, besides the fact that they're spreading libel and patently false information, is that they have the rhetoric of radicalism embedded in them. So they would mention the hyphen, right, in my last name as a sign that I'm a liberal feminist with an agenda, right? Or they would focus on the last part of my name, which is Germanic from my husband, right, as me being Jewish, in order to promote some sort of anti-Semitism, or call me, and this is a direct quote, a Jew subversive, right, trying to infiltrate the church. And now that the book is out, they're still doing that. But they're also posting content about a book that they haven't written, or read, rather. Like they'll post something and they'll say, I haven't read this book, but I have it on good authority that this is not true, right? Or some version of that. And what's fascinating is their ideologies are very clear in their attempts at this pushback, right? Their social discourse, very sadly, reinforces the arguments in the latter half of my book about how the internet is used to foster religious radicalism, and also as a space to sort of build political communitas. So in doing that, right, in that pushback, they reinforce what has been written about them.
Maybe they haven't been, you said these weren't people necessarily in that community that you spent time with, but now they have identified themselves with that community to an extent, or at least some of those political beliefs. So now they've written themselves into your book, even though it wasn't about them. Right.
I've had people, I've had people say, oh, I hope she writes about me. It's like, well, no, because you're not part of this narrative. Are you in this community? No. Right. But if they see themselves as part of ROCOR, or part of Russian Orthodoxy, as it is loosely developed in the United States, between the OCA, ROCOR, and the MP parishes and others, they feel like they have a stake in it, and they want to somehow fight, right?
So let's talk more about that identification with Russia.
Yeah.
Right. Your book does a great job focusing on kind of you already mentioned this kind of political affiliation where they see Putin as a type of saving figure, which in itself is just mind-boggling, especially in present moments. But
right.
Veneration of the Romanovs and kind of this monarchic mentality preferable to democracy. So for those maybe who haven't read the book, share with us a little bit more how this identification with Russia, how it works, right?
Yeah.
We see that it is, but how is it appealing for some, especially these Orthodox converts, right?
Sure.
So people that are not from a like Russian immigrant family who have chosen to take this on, growing up maybe as a Protestant, just white American man in his 30s to 60s, as you point out, as many of your participants were. So how do those ties emerge and what do they look like?
Sure. I think one thing that's important to know about both this group and sort of the growing movement of reactive orthodoxy in the US is the emphasis that they have on traditional values or traditional Christian lifestyle. And I'm not talking about big T tradition, right, of Orthodox theology and practice, or even the small t sort of vernacular practices that become part of the faith at a local level. This is traditionalism as a sort of reactive philosophy that pushes for a certain type of purity, a retreat from modernity. And of course, I want to say that this is not all Orthodox Christians, right? Not all Orthodox Christians adhere to these sort of fundamentalist notions of traditionalism, even if they say, well, I'm traditional, right? There's a difference. But this type of traditionalism is in these vocal subsects, and it's very exclusionary. It's based in issues of purity, as you noted, social, sometimes racial, sexual. So the question is, why do they find Russia appealing? What's with Russia, right? And one thing I think is important to note about many of these traditionalists, these reactive Orthodox, is that they're done with American democracy. They don't believe democracy is a congruent political institution with orthodoxy. In other words, they can't be part of a democratic society and be Orthodox. They're interested in authoritarianism or some sort of vision of monarchic governance. And so they see these king-like figures abroad, like Putin, or in the case of someone like Rod Dreher, who I might call reactive light, Viktor Orban in Hungary. And they seem to believe that these political strongmen can secure a different future for them, one that not only supports their moral values, but can enforce them through policymaking. So for these reactive converts who are turning to Russian Orthodoxy, they see Putin in the post-Soviet context as this guardian of conservative family values. They hope that he might be a potential reviver of contemporary monarchic governance in Russia, maybe in the United States. And, to be honest, let's think about how Putin markets himself, right? He tries to show himself, at least prior to 2022, right, as this sort of devout Orthodox Christian. He has a spiritual father. He goes to confession. He has a relationship with Patriarch Kirill. All of this to those abroad who are reading mostly Russian news sources, right, or English translated Russian news sources, or talking to priests in the Russian Orthodox Church, it seems to make Putin at least sympathetic to the ideological desires of these communities. And so if he's working for an anti-modern future where conservative Christianity and politics are working together for the betterment of Christianity, that's appealing to them. That's really appealing, because at the end of the day, they didn't want to make America great again, like, a la Trump's vision, right, during 2016 to 2020. They wanted to make it holy. And prior to 2022, Putin really seemed to be up to that task.
Do you think that, the church, do they, in some ways, certainly we have within ROCOR and this appeal to Russia, its own kind of particular thing, but are there other kind of spaces maybe where the church leans into that? We offer an alternative, a holy, a pure, that kind of traditionalism, these traditional values, right, that's appealing to similar types of converts, maybe that aren't necessarily looking for Putin, but are looking for kind of similar types of values, right?
I mean, we know that by and large, Orthodoxy skews conservative, right? It's a constantly backwards looking religion in terms of we have to return to the fathers, we have to adhere to tradition. So that already, I think, is appealing for people that have these conservative sensibilities and want to find something that can support that. But I think that this is different than that because it has a sort of geopolitical dimension to these issues of morality and purity that we don't often see among Christian conservatives in the United States. I mean, this is where morality is secured through foreign intervention. And that's clearly an impulse towards purity and tradition that is in direct opposition to the immigrant history of ROCOR life. You know, so that to me, I think is what is sort of like mind bending to think about that, right? And in many ways, colonizing of an immigrant faith.
You just mentioned this emphasis on purity. We see it in the book, emphasis on traditional gender roles by many of those that you interviewed, and something that we see mimicked again in recent Russian Orthodox hierarchical rhetoric about Ukraine. Could you provide us, for those who haven't read it, with a few examples from your research of what that specifically looks like? And I personally was struck by the example you offered in your book that your husband had to come to the abbot so that you could receive his blessing, both the abbot, I suppose, and your husband's blessing to do your research, which I was just kind of baffled by this. But yeah, maybe provide us a few examples of what that kind of emphasis on purity and gender and morality might look like for this community.
I think my husband was also very, very, very baffled by that as well. One thing I think that story with the abbot does is it highlights the androcentric sort of patriarchal nature of Russian Orthodoxy among converts. You know, this is not always the way cradles feel about ROCOR, but converts tend to see the faith in as much more geared towards a division of the sexes with this real emphasis on male authority, on leadership, on spiritual fathers. I remember one woman in the community telling me, you know, I do whatever, I get a blessing for everything from my spiritual father, right? Like everything. Like to have a cough drop before liturgy, there was a blessing.
So that for the spiritual father.
Right. Like that's a lot, right? That's a lot. And we know, of course, that there's this long history of conservative Christians seeing anyone outside of sort of the heteronormative family and sort of the traditional gender roles as sort of theologically impure or morally corrupt. But in ROCOR, and I think this is in part because of the political and theological issues that were baked into the origin story, right? That preserving of the church abroad and sort of what St. John of San Francisco calls the crystalline purity. There's that focus on theological, ethnic purity and preservation, right, in opposition to growing secularism in Russia and the Soviet Union. But I think that appealed to converts. And then when I would argue Seraphim Rose helped open up the Russian church to American converts through English language materials, that notion of purity for many who were already ideologically inclined to these conservative social values, it took on a more gendered angle. So you have this really heavy emphasis on keeping children safe via homeschooling, keeping them safe from those outside of the heteronormative family. You have this very strict division of labor, all of these sort of things that come up as part of Orthodox theology, which are not really. They're part of the social ethos of conservatism in the United States that have become slowly part of the shaping mechanism through which converts view ROCOR. So I'll give you two quick stories that I think sort of highlight these purity emphasis and gender roles. So in the community I worked in, there was a monastery, which made the issues of gender and purity a little bit more obvious than you might see in a normal parish. And I had one pilgrim, a female pilgrim who was there, tell me that she'd visited years ago and she went in line for communion and a monk came up to her and he said, "Are you on your period?" And that was really, it took her a long time to get over that and come back to the monastery. She eventually did. But that gender binary doesn't stop with the dividing of the sexes in the nave. It's how children are educated. It's how family labor, like cleaning and cooking And now, even among more reactive women online, it's in this call for the rescinding of voting rights for women, and the push to tell women they shouldn't hold office, that their place is in the home. They shouldn't be academics. They should just, their role is that of complementing their husband, right? Which is not really Orthodox. That's a lot of Protestant holdover baggage that we see coming in. So this emphasis they have on purity is not just about holiness, right? It's about making ROCOR and Orthodoxy into something quite toxic and not in line with the teachings of the church. And what I find fascinating, Ashley, is that they're using like the writings of esoteric monks, monks that we usually don't find as superstars of the church, right?
Superstar
right?
monks.
Right. They're not the ones that we're like, okay, we know who those are. Those are, those are great defenders of the faith. They're revered, right? These are these very esoteric monks who they sort of used to back their claims of female subjugation. And I think we have to remember that they're esoteric for a reason. And the concern is that these laymen will use these monks' works, and they'll turn to these like so-called holy elders, right? Rather than their own priests, rather than the writings of theologians. And that's a problem because they're modeling a Protestant type of theological training to build their social reality through content that reinforces ideological assumptions about what is right.
Or the use of the canons or the rudder as like, oh, well, it says this about women. So we're just, that's what we're doing now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now, when I left West Virginia, I visited Jordanville, Holy Trinity Monastery Seminary, which many on here might know as one of the historic sites of Russian Orthodoxy and ROCOR in the US. I'd been there previously in 2015. I was surprised to see by the time I returned in 2019, a real transformation. They had started using English language as the primary language in their courses. I attended a conference, and I write about this in the book, actually. It was titled Chastity, Purity, and Integrity, Orthodox Anthropology and the Secular Culture in the 21st Century. And there's videos and there's transcripts and audio recordings on Ancient Faith Radio. Some of the lectures were published in a subsequent volume that was put out by the press at the monastery. And I interviewed the convert who helped organize it. And the entire conference was organized by converts. The majority of the speakers were converts. And most of the attendees were converts. In fact, I ended up sitting next to Rod Dreher at one point. And they came from conservative to very far right backgrounds. And some of them have gone on to become internet micro celebrities, which is quite shocking and alarming in many ways. And these conversations were quite reactive and directly emphasizing that post-Soviet Russia was the protector of Christianity in the apostate West. And it did so through preserving family values, through preserving purity. So one woman lamented
the way controlling women's sexuality and bodies, but that's
right.
Right.
So one woman said, I really love my daughter's, she was an attendee, and she said, I really love my daughter's school, but I'm concerned because her teacher is gay. And I think that's not good. What if that, that sort of demonic spirit sort of gets onto her, right? And they told her, you should, if at all possible, you should homeschool your child to keep them away from this perversion. And, that's that type of insulary, it's not even, it's so far removed from the Benedict option, which is about like sort of these intentional communities, which Catholicism has been doing for a very long time in Florida. It's something beyond that, right? And that to me is the sort of the disturbing part of it, because cutting oneself off from reality in this attempt to create a caustic world in which anyone who doesn't adhere with your views is out, that's a problem. That's not Orthodox.
I wonder too how someone can transform the world, through their Orthodox presence or, be in communion with it if we've kind of removed ourselves completely, aside from the monks who that's the thing, right? Is to pray for the world away from it. But
yeah.
Well, tell us, a little bit about how, I mean, this perhaps we could spend a whole other webinar about this. How do you think current events that are unfolding since you wrote the book, maybe even just in the last few days, right? And we can think broadly too. It doesn't have to just center on events happening from Russia and the US's reaction, things like that, might shape the religious identities like those you see in your book. And we can also think maybe about how these communities, like the one you studied, might develop in the future with second, third generation convert, now cradle Orthodox, children growing into adults and that type of thing. So how do you see those current events affecting these types of communities? And then how might those communities develop over time? If you could speak to that.
Well, I'm going to read Current Events as Ukraine. And I think we're already seeing some developments. I mean, there's certainly those who are grappling with how the Moscow Patriarchate could support this war. But there are those who tend to justify it on some level, which I find really fascinating. And my next research project actually is about the relationship between religious transformation and technology. I'm thinking about how Orthodox far right are using social media to spread misinformation, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and this war is part of that. The justification by many of these reactive Orthodox online is based in this anti-modern propaganda. I can't tell you, Ashley, how many tweets and social media posts I've seen about Zelensky being a Jewish asset of the US deep state. So to go back to your question, how do I think that this will transform? I think the community in Appalachia was far right. But I think the next movement or wave or generation, whatever we're calling it, is far more radical. And that's really part of that instantaneous movement of information. I mean, much of which is false, and it's so hard to control. Right. And then you have the rise of these far right Orthodox micro celebrities online. And it's very clear that these folks are not only a threat to democracy, as some of them actually post in their bios, but that they're a threat to Orthodoxy. They're a threat to the authority of the church. And to just give you a quick example, there's a prominent Twitter user. He has over 10,000 followers, which, I mean, that's not a lot, but in Orthodox in the US, that is a lot, right? He's a young man from the American South. He's a convert. He's an anti-vaxxer. And his followers are so dedicated that they will write in their social media bios that they have been radicalized by him, which is code for converting to Orthodoxy. The other thing I find disturbing is that it's not just lay people. I mean, there are priests and deacons who are actively spreading propaganda and lies, and they're networking with far right, mostly laymen, even hosting events with them. So this is a problem, and it's only going to get worse, and we can't turn away from it. We can't pray it away. We have to acknowledge that there are radicals among us, and they're bent on transforming Orthodoxy into a vision of what they think it should be. And really, it's not about theology. Again, it's about this culture wars rhetoric, which ultimately, it's kind of ironic. It's giving into the machinations of secularism, which they're trying to ultimately avoid. And I remember this Russian woman told me how disturbed she was in Appalachia by a white male convert. She said, Orthodoxy is in our blood. It's in our bones. What do they want with it? And I would argue ultimately that they convert because they believe, of course, that they found the true faith, but their ideological rigorism is in many ways the colonization of an immigrant faith. And they do that through their hyper focus on purity, through their particular notions of morality, their political philosophies, whether it be America First or monarchism, that they believe are congruent with Orthodoxy and that can enforce their visions for a holy world through policymaking. And that's not healthy or sustainable for our church in the long run.
Right. And that, I mean, it too, what you might have had, perhaps not in these convert heavy congregations, but maybe you'd have one person or a few people at a, more maybe immigrant heavy parish. Now they have online communities to feel that validation, right? Yes. In those identities, feel that kind of authenticity, find mentors and a type of validation that otherwise might be corrected by the parish priest or, the friendly old church lady who says that's not Russian Orthodoxy. Right now, there's kind of validation going on. So our last question before we turn maybe to some Q&A, if you're if you're comfortable, could you reflect on your experience as both a scholar and as an Orthodox woman about what you researched? You've done an impressive job in the book where you bracket kind of your own reactions and keep a very kind of objective, genuine understanding as a researcher. But maybe share with us your own reactions to this type of orthodoxy. Some viewers may have encountered these types of sentiments in their own churches. What might a response be? I mean, we can't, as you said, we can't just turn a blind eye to it as this being unorthodox and therefore, you know, it's not a thing that's happening. It is happening. So what's your reaction? What might a response look like?
Overall, after writing this book, I'm struck by how normative this community appears, considering what I've seen on social media. That's my first reaction. In terms of parishioners, I think one thing that's important for your viewers to know is that if they feel that they might be encountering this type of ideology in their parishes, this is not religious or social conservatism. What reactive Orthodox Christians preach has ideological inflections that are steeped in far-right American conspiratorial counterculture, not Orthodox theology. These are not classic conservatives. They're not just dedicated or pious Christians. They're not Uber converts, right? They come in and they just want to do everything, right, all at once.
That zeal.
Right. They're not just zealous, right? They're reactionaries. And I actually talked to a deacon recently who teaches catechism for his parish. And he mentioned that the first thing he does is he tries to weed out ideologies of white nationalism, white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and monarchism. And he tells people, stop turning to these online spiritual guides. Don't read them. Read the church fathers, read the mothers, read classics, read, Callistos Vare, read early theologians, read contemporary theologians, read Staniloy, read Bulgakov. Don't read these online guides. And he worries at the same time that this is not enough. And, as a researcher, practitioner, I'm worried too. We see the language of history and tradition being used to spread political ideology. And we can't let far-right radicalism infect the faith. We have to talk about these matters really openly and frankly. Somebody said in a sort of reaction to one of my posts, why are you airing dirty laundry of the church? Well, that right there is a statement that we have to acknowledge that there is dirty laundry and that we have to do something about it. We have to examine why there's social conflicts occurring between parishioners and congregations, between jurisdictions. And I think to do so demands that we hold the bishops accountable and tell them that, look, there are problems and you need to deal with these. And that we take seriously Orthodox social media culture wars rather than sort of dismissing them as, oh, this is in the digital space. It's not going to affect the real world. It's going to affect the real world. It is affecting the real world. There was an Orthodox priest at the January 6th insurrection. This is a real world problem. And so if we want to have a sustainable plan for Orthodoxy for the future, we've got to do something about the far right.
And also to think about the people's digital lives as part of their spiritual lives, which I think perhaps maybe that turning away from the world and technology that maybe we don't see anymore, but we did maybe a few decades ago, has left some people not quite equipped, right, to deal with how people behave online, as that's just, like you said, maybe that's something else and not a sphere of the church. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. One of them asks, and I think this is kind of centered in your book, can you speak about the influence of Seraphim Rose on modern day ROCOR? And I'd say Orthodox converts, even outside of ROCOR, have found him very appealing, influential. Share with us a little bit about his influence and why this person, this man from California who studied Buddhism came to be like the monk superstar, perhaps, for a lot of converts.
Well, I will say I have a deep affinity for Seraphim Rose. I think he is misunderstood or misinterpreted by converts. I have some of what might be considered his relics in my house. Like, I think he is very fascinating and a really interesting spiritual figure who struggled with his own sexuality, with his own spirituality throughout his life. And I think that his work has been taken up as sort of, he's sort of a soft figurehead for a movement that I don't think he would agree with if he was alive today. in terms of being influential, I would say that he is, because he was able to translate and write in English, right, for people who might convert. And again, as Ashley said, it's not just Roquefort. And so, you know, his books are sold widely throughout parish, bookstores. They're in parish libraries. They're at seminaries. They're throughout Russia. He's much beloved. I mean, one of the things the monks who visited Russia while I was there were two monks who went on a retreat to Russia, and then they came back and they gave like a slideshow presentation to a group of us. One of the things they asked is, did you know Father Seraphim Rose in Russia? That's what they would ask these monks. And they're like, no, I mean, he died a long time ago. You know, we're not even that old. But they were just anything they could learn about Seraphim Rose, they were absolutely fascinated. And so I think if we just dismiss him as sort of some esoteric figure, right? He's not esoteric. He's very centered. Almost every man I spoke with mentioned Seraphim Rose as an influence, as a guide for how to become a convert in the contemporary United States. So that's really important, I think. And I think it has a shaping effect on the movement of converts to contemporary Orthodoxy, which then is transforming modern day Orthodoxy.
So we have a few questions in the Q&A that are asking, do you see comparisons either between types of reactive or far-right movements in Roman Catholicism, other Christian reactive political theologies? So do you see any connections? And I mean, again, your focus has been on these Orthodox communities. So maybe you could speak to, is this reflective of other broader trends in American religion?
Yeah, I mean, there's great scholars right now writing about trad Catholics and far-right Protestants. And I see a lot of slippage in sort of the language and the ideology between them. I will say that far-right Orthodox tend to be more focused on monarchic politics. You see a lot more in Catholicism and in Protestantism in the far right. You see a lot more focus on like America First. You see much more focus on libertarianism rather than a monarch, right? But at the same time, they're all talking to each other because they're all little groups within this sort of constellation of the far right. And so you'll have people who consider themselves far right, nominally Christian, who then become friends with far right Orthodox. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 months later, you'll see in their Twitter bio that they've converted to Russian Orthodoxy. So I think that the far right Orthodox movement is seeing themselves as missionaries to these other far right groups, which I don't see that sort of same missionizing zeal among the Protestants towards the Catholics or the Orthodox, and the Catholics towards the Protestants or the Orthodox.
Among other Orthodox jurisdictions. So I think the online space has given us a lot of kind of crossover where one might attend a Roquefort parish, but is then talking to, you know, someone who goes to an Antiochian parish or an OCA or even a Greek parish. So is there, do you see similarities among other jurisdictions with these types of sentiments or even communities? Yeah,
I would say that, you know, I specifically created the term reactive Orthodox because I think that it's easily applicable to other jurisdictions. There are absolutely people in the Antiochian, OCA, Serbian, Romanian who have these views, right? I would say it's largely associated with Roquefort, but you see crossover, absolutely. And you see people who are in OCA or Greek parishes saying, I don't think this is conservative enough. I don't understand why we're allowing pews. We need to get rid of pews. Why aren't women covering their heads? And then you'll see someone comment to them, oh, you should come to Roquefort. We do all of that, right? And then they'll say things like, I converted to Roquefort, right? They're using the language of conversion interjurisdictionally, which is a problem. It's
theologically, it's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. Yeah.
But I think that also gets to the idea of kind of America as being a spiritual marketplace where you have, you know, in Pittsburgh, you have what, like 8 different Orthodox jurisdictions. And within that, you know, maybe 100 parishes where you could pick and choose kind of which, I don't know, flavor is the right fit for you based on kind of who goes there. Yeah. Do they have pews or do they have, you know, just an open space, women covering their heads or a large homeschool community? So, there's a lot of that kind of choice too, I think, that we see even not just online, but also
absolutely.
in those parishes. So we did have a question asking if you could distinguish between a faith that takes its heritage or tradition seriously. And we certainly see, this is my own, not in the question, a lot of Orthodox, right, teaching that is more conservative, like you said, returning to sources, preserving the faith. And then what is one that is conservative, where they intersect and where they diverge. So, you know, where do we draw the line and say, oh, that is now reactive orthodoxy, opposed to that's just a very maybe zealous or person who loves the heritage of their faith, or the traditions and teachings and moral values that are taught. So how do we distinguish between those kind of things?
That is a great question. I would say I can think about it from personal experience, right? So my patron saint is Saint Elizabeth the New Martyr, right? I really admire her. I've read her writings. I really think she was a great woman of faith. I really like her. At the same time, I don't hope that she's going to somehow, you know, on a trans-temporal platform, affect global politics and somehow bring back a czar, right? That's reactive. If I have an icon of her and I venerate her and I maybe read her writings and I appreciate her heritage and that's appreciation, right? There's a difference. Now, in terms of conservatism, I think we also have to look at the history of Orthodoxy. It's a living history, right? And it's a living tradition, which means it adapts, right? We've seen that adaptation beautifully in Alaska. If you think about how Orthodoxy is developed in Alaska, tradition doesn't mean that you're constantly adhering to one thing. It means that over time, tradition develops, it moves, it lives, it has its being in the world. And it can change. Sometimes it doesn't change. But I think staunchly returning to something and being so adamant that this is the only way things can be is when we start to get that that error code, right? That something's just not right. That this is taking it a step too far. And that's, I think, what we have to look for. When people start using Orthodox theology to promote hate rather than love, then we have a problem.
So a follow-up to that, one of our attendees asks, how can then, especially if we think to what you said about how many priests have also, and clergy are also involved in this type of more reactive type of ideology, how can Western converts find safe and wise sources and people to trust in the church?
Right.
So, I mean, where does one start? Because the internet is often the first place people go to learn about Orthodoxy, maybe even before going to a church. And if they go to a church and they have maybe a priest or a large, you know, how would they know?
Right. Absolutely. No, that's a great question, because what do you do? Right. I think the first step is to think about, first of all, I would, you know, I'm not a theologian, but I would say the first step would be to read your Bible and to read people who are widely cited in Orthodox studies. So if you're reading, you know, if you're reading the Ecumenical Patriarch, if you're reading Callistos Ware, right? If you're reading people who are repeatedly cited over and over and over, that's a more status quo take on Orthodoxy than if somebody's like, oh, Elder so-and-so of the tiny mountain, you know, whose writings have just been uncovered last week, right? You know that you'll have a little bit more, that those writings have longevity in the church, right? You know that the writings of St. Basil the Great have longevity in the church, right? Stick with those superstars that we talked about earlier. And if your priest is saying, hey, I think you should read this person who has what clearly seems to be a take baked not in love, but in sort of a puritanical worldview, then you know something's a little off.
Right. Maybe we can shift gears just a little bit. We had a question about the pseudonyms that you use in your book. And I know that some ethnographers allow their participants to self-select their pseudonyms. So they were asking, is that your idea, or did your interlocutors suggest those? And perhaps that might also be a space where you can share with us a little bit more about your methodology as a researcher going into this space. How did that unfold for you?
Yeah, so I I worked very closely with my IRB board. It's called an institutional review board, to create an ethical research methods that would protect the people I was working with, because I knew it was a small community. And even if I wasn't writing anything that might be reactive, I wanted to make sure that people were protected, because small communities are easily identifiable. And their suggestion right away was that you use pseudonyms. In anthropology, a lot of anthropologists use pseudonyms for their interlocutors, unless they consider themselves activist anthropologists and they really want to promote the ideas and values of the community they're working with. So when I created the consent form, which everyone gave oral consent on the record, I would read this consent form and it would say, you know, I'm going to use a pseudonym. You can choose your own pseudonym or I can choose one for you. And most people opted to have me choose a pseudonym for them. I tried really hard because most people identified as having some sort of Scotch-Irish or Anglo background, to pick saints' names that were from the British Isles, from Ireland, or from what they saw as their ethnic background or family heritage. So that's how I came to use pseudonyms in the book. In terms of research methodology, all of the interviews that you see in the book were recorded. Everyone gave consent on the record. They were told that no one else would hear the recordings, that I would be the person who transcribes the recordings. And they knew that I was writing a book about them. Many people asked for the questions in advance because they just wanted to prepare, and they wanted to make sure that they knew what they wanted to say. So they right away saw that they were going to be asked about Putin. They were going to be asked about their political views. They were in no way shocked about them.
Right. So we have kind of two questions in the Q&A that focus on that this is kind of a negative topic, and that you, having spent so much time in this reactive Orthodox world as a researcher, what do you do to, one person says, continue to feed and sustain yourself with living maybe within mainstream Orthodoxy? If you want to share this, we don't need to hear your hobbies, but think about your scholarship, right? Like, how do you continue to find joy in the work that you do when it is, right, you're encountering both pushback from online individuals and also dealing with conflict within your own religious community? So how do you kind of find joy? If you could maybe leave us, I think maybe I'll have time for one more question, on a kind of uplifting note here in your own practices.
I think in my own practices, I try to think about side projects that will bring me joy. And two of those are working on women in the church and disability and inclusion in the church. Those are two things that are very near and dear to my heart. And I work on projects that will help create a more inclusive space for women and people with disabilities in Orthodoxy. So any and all projects that you want to throw my way on those, folks, I'm really happy to work on them. Those are the projects that bring me the most joy.
And you already mentioned a little bit earlier kind of your next book project, but maybe you could say a little bit more in our last few minutes together, if you would, about what you're going to be working on next for your next book project.
So my next book project, sadly, it's a little bit of a downer. It is about anti-Semitism and racism online, connected to the legacy of American racism and European fascism. So it's a quite ambitious project, but I think one that's very important. And then I will say, leaving you on a little bit of a high note, my next project after that will be about women in the church, and then about disability in the church. So I have a trajectory that I'm getting to happier topics as the years will go on, hopefully.
May you be blessed with enough time to do all these things that are very important, both for the church and the scholarly community. And we look forward to reading them. So I think on that note, we'll close here with our questions. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our guest. It was just a joy to hear about your book. And again, if you haven't You should purchase it. You should read it. You should take copious amounts of notes. Buy for your church library. I think that might be. We did have a question about how to deal with these types of things. I think it's there's a lot to learn from, both as an Orthodox Christian and both as a scholar, in a scholarly format. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us again. Our next episode will be May 20th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time with Professor Mary Farag, What Makes a Church Sacred? And we hope you'll join us again then. And as always, you'll be able to view this recording and our previous episodes on the Center's YouTube page. Thank you.